The hard truth about respect. Why chasing it makes you lose it. There comes a moment in life when you realize something has shifted. The voices that once called out, "Dad, can you help me?" or "Mom, what do you think?" have grown quieter. The conversations that used to be filled with warmth and laughter now feel distant, rushed, almost obligatory. You sit in a quiet room, staring at your phone, wondering when your children stopped seeing you the same way. It's a slow and painful realization. Respect, once given so freely, has started to fade. You spent decades sacrificing, supporting, and guiding them. And yet, now, they barely ask for your advice. Your words are brushed aside, your presence taken for granted. You don't know exactly when it happened, but you feel it deep in your heart. If you've ever felt this way, you're not alone. I've been there, many parents have, and I want to share something with you, something that can change everything. Because the truth is, demanding respect won't bring it back. Getting angry won't fix it. But there is a way to regain it, without arguments, without resentment, and without losing yourself in the process. In this video, I'll share personal experiences, lessons I've learned, and practical steps you can take to shift the way your children see you. It's not too late to change things. It's not too late to reclaim your dignity, your voice, and the respect you deserve. But before we begin, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever felt like your children don't see you the same way they once did? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and your stories matter. And if this message resonates with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps spread these messages to more people who might need to hear them. Now, let's begin. 1. The pain of being forgotten. There was a moment when I realized I had been waiting for my children to call, waiting for an invitation to visit, waiting for them to make me feel like I still mattered in their lives. At first, I told myself it was normal. After all, I had spent decades devoted to them, shaping their futures, making sure they had everything they needed. But as time went on, the waiting turned into loneliness, and the loneliness turned into quiet resentment. My friend Jonathan went through something similar. He had always been the kind of father who put his children first, sometimes at the expense of his own happiness. When they were young, he found joy in their laughter, in their small hands reaching for his. But as they grew older and their own lives became filled with careers, families, and responsibilities, Jonathan found himself feeling like an afterthought. He called often, sometimes too often, just to hear their voices. He reminded them how much he missed them, how he wished they would visit more. But instead of bringing them closer, his efforts had the opposite effect. His children saw his calls as an obligation, something they had to deal with rather than something they looked forward to. One evening over coffee, Jonathan admitted, "I don't think they mean to push me away, but I can feel it. And I hate how much it affects me." That conversation stuck with me. I saw pieces of myself in his words. The truth was, I had been doing the same thing. Relying on my children to give me a sense of purpose, to reassure me that I was still needed. And in doing so, I had unknowingly placed a burden on them. So I made a change. Instead of waiting for their calls, I filled my days with things that brought me joy. I picked up old hobbies, joined a local group, and reconnected with old friends. I learned to enjoy my own company, to wake up in the morning with plans that had nothing to do with whether my children remembered to check in. And something unexpected happened. My phone started ringing more. My children began reaching out, curious about what I was up to. The conversations felt lighter, more natural, no longer weighed down by the unspoken pressure of my loneliness. Jonathan did the same. He found a new passion for gardening, something he had always wanted to try but never had time for. Slowly, his children started visiting more, not because they felt guilty, but because they enjoyed being around him again. They saw a father who was content, who had a life of his own, and they respected him for it. Letting go of emotional dependence doesn't mean loving your children any less. It means loving yourself enough to build a fulfilling life that doesn't rely on them to complete it. When you find happiness outside of them, they will naturally gravitate back toward you, not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. 2. The hard truth about respect. I remember the countless times I sat across from my son, frustration simmering beneath my skin as I tried to make him see my point of view. I wasn't asking for much, just a little consideration, a little acknowledgement that my experience in life counted for something. But every time I raised my voice, every time I tried to demand his respect, I felt it slipping further from my grasp. My old friend Robert had gone through something similar. He was once a respected figure in his profession, a man whose words carried weight. But at home, his grown children treated him differently. They dismissed his concerns, laughed off his advice, and barely listened when he spoke. At first, Robert fought back. He would argue, reminding them of all he had done, insisting that he deserved better. But instead of changing their behavior, his children pulled away. They avoided conversations, shortened visits, and treated him as though he were just an old man clinging to the past. Watching Robert struggle made me take a hard look at myself. I saw how my own efforts to assert authority only created more distance between me and my son. The truth hit me. You can't force someone to respect you. Respect isn't won through arguments, it's inspired by presence, by the way you carry yourself. So I tried something different. I stopped chasing their approval. Instead of raising my voice, I lowered it. Instead of demanding that they listen, I listened to them. I stopped offering advice unless they asked for it, and when I spoke, I made sure my words had meaning. I carried myself with quiet confidence, as if I already knew my value, because deep down, I did. It wasn't immediate, but over time, my son's attitude shifted. He started noticing the difference. He began asking for my thoughts rather than ignoring them. He lingered a little longer in our conversations. I didn't need to remind him of my worth. He could see it for himself. Robert took the same approach, and the results were striking. His children, once dismissive, began seeing him in a new light. He had stopped fighting for their respect and instead embodied the kind of man who naturally commanded it. I won't say it's easy. There were days I wanted to snap, to remind them of everything I had sacrificed, to demand the recognition I felt I deserved. But I learned that dignity speaks louder than words. If you carry yourself with self-respect, others will start to follow. And in time, the respect you once fought for will return. Not because you asked for it, but because you earned it. 3. When giving becomes a burden. Respect your generosity, or one day, you will have nothing left to give but resentment. For most of my life, I believed that as a father, my duty was to give, without limits, without conditions. I told myself that as long as my children were happy, I would be happy. I paid for things they needed. I was there whenever they called. I helped without being asked. But over the years, something changed. The gratitude that once warmed my heart was replaced by expectation. A simple, "Thank you, Dad," became rare. My support was no longer seen as an act of kindness, but as something they assumed would always be there. My friend Daniel experienced the same thing. He had always been the provider in his family. His children knew they could count on him, whether it was financial help, time, or effort. But one day, Daniel found himself in an unexpected situation. His car broke down, and for once, he needed help. He called his son, hoping for a ride. The response? "I'm busy, Dad. Can't you call someone else?" That moment hit him like a brick wall. He had spent years giving without question, yet when he finally needed something in return, he was treated like an inconvenience. He wasn't angry, just heartbroken. That was the day he decided to stop giving where it wasn't appreciated. Daniel didn't cut his children off. He didn't stop loving them. But he changed the way he gave. When they asked for money, he started asking questions. What's the plan for paying this back? When they needed a favor, he'd check his schedule before immediately saying yes. And when he did help, it was because he chose to, not because he felt obligated. At first, his children were frustrated. They were used to the easy yes. But over time, they began to realize something. Their father's generosity was a gift, not a guarantee. Slowly, they started expressing gratitude again. They stopped taking him for granted. I learned from Daniel. I stopped giving out of habit and started giving with intention. And something incredible happened. My children began to appreciate me more. They called not just when they needed something, but to check in, to talk, to reconnect. If you feel like your love and effort are being taken for granted, ask yourself, am I giving in a way that fosters respect, or in a way that fosters expectation? Have you ever felt like you've given too much without receiving appreciation? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your experiences. 4. Draw the line where it matters. You are not powerless. You are not just an aging parent waiting on the sidelines of your children's lives. You deserve to be treated with respect, not because you demand it, but because you command it through the way you carry yourself. And that begins with setting boundaries, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. I used to believe that letting things slide was the best way to keep my family together. If my children interrupted me, I let it go. If they dismissed my opinions with a laugh, I told myself it wasn't worth arguing over. I didn't want to be the difficult father, the one who created tension. But as time passed, I realized something troubling. My silence had taught them that it was okay to overlook me. I had unknowingly set a standard, and that standard was that my feelings, my voice, and my presence were optional. I remember my friend Leonard, a man who had once been the pillar of his family. He was a successful businessman, respected in his community, yet at home, his grown children treated him as if his opinions no longer mattered. They criticized his decisions, interrupted him mid-sentence, and barely acknowledged his presence at family gatherings. For years, Leonard shrugged it off. They're busy, he'd say. They don't mean anything by it. But deep down, he felt it, the sting of being dismissed. One evening, after yet another conversation where he was talked over and brushed aside, Leonard finally had enough. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. Instead, he calmly told his children, "I love you all, but I will no longer be part of conversations where I am not treated with respect. If I'm not heard, then I have nothing to say." At first, they were surprised. They brushed it off as one of their father's moods. But Leonard stood firm. The next time they interrupted him, he simply stopped talking and walked away. When they dismissed his advice, he no longer tried to argue. He made it clear, if they wanted him in their lives, they had to show him the basic courtesy he deserved. It didn't take long for his children to notice the shift. Slowly, they started changing the way they spoke to him. They listened more, they interrupted less, and they acknowledged his wisdom instead of dismissing it. Not because he demanded it, but because he showed them that his time, his thoughts, and his presence were worth respecting. I took inspiration from Leonard. I stopped accepting behavior that made me feel small. I set boundaries, not as a punishment, but as a reflection of my own self-worth. And I saw the same transformation in my children. They learned that respect is not something you give freely. It is something that is earned through the way you allow others to treat you. So if you find yourself being overlooked, dismissed, or spoken to without care, ask yourself, What am I allowing? Respect starts with you. When you set your boundaries with quiet confidence and follow through with action, others will learn to follow. And in time, they will not just love you as a parent, but respect you as a person. 5. Rediscover yourself beyond parenthood. You are more than just a parent. You are a person with dreams, interests, and a life worth living, at any age. There was a time when I felt like my world had shrunk. My children had grown up, built their own families, and filled their lives with new priorities. Meanwhile, I found myself waiting for their calls, waiting for an invitation to visit, waiting for a reason to feel needed again. I convinced myself that being deeply involved in their lives was the only way to stay connected. But instead of bringing us closer, it only made me feel more distant. My friend Henry had a similar struggle. After retiring, he poured all his energy into staying connected with his children. He called them every day, offered advice even when they didn't ask, and adjusted his schedule to match theirs. But over time, he noticed their visits became less frequent, their conversations shorter. One day, his daughter said something that stuck with him. "Dad, you should find something to do for yourself." At first, those words hurt. But the more he thought about them, the more he realized she was right. Henry took up painting, something he had always wanted to do but never had time for. He started going to community events, meeting new people, even traveling to places he had only ever dreamed about. And something interesting happened. His children started reaching out more. They asked about his hobbies, showed interest in his travels, and genuinely wanted to spend time with him, not out of obligation, but because they were drawn to his energy. I saw the change in Henry and decided to do the same. Instead of waiting for my children to fill my days, I filled them myself. I went back to reading books that had collected dust on my shelves. I reconnected with old friends. I took long walks and appreciated the world around me. And before I knew it, my days were full, not just with activity, but with purpose. And just like with Henry, my children started seeing me differently. They weren't just checking in because they felt they had to. They wanted to hear about my life. They respected me not just as their father, but as a man who still had so much to experience. If you feel like you are being overlooked, like your children don't see you the way they once did, ask yourself, have I been living for them or for myself? Show them that you are still growing, still dreaming, still alive in every sense of the word. Because when they see you truly living, they will not only respect you more, they will want to be part of your world again. Do you agree that parents should rediscover themselves beyond their children? If you think yes, comment 1. If you disagree, comment 0. I'd love to hear your thoughts. 6. Be the tree that sways, not the one that breaks. An old tree that never bends with the wind eventually cracks under pressure. But the tree that sways, that adapts, remains standing. Parents are like that tree. If we remain rigid in our ways, unwilling to change as the world around us does, we risk becoming distant from our children, losing not just their attention but their respect. I used to believe that my way of thinking, my values, and my habits were things my children should always follow. I had built my life on certain principles, and I wanted them to see the world the way I did. But the more I tried to impose these views, the more they pulled away. It wasn't that they didn't love me, it was that they lived in a different time, with different challenges, and my refusal to acknowledge that made them feel unheard. My friend Martin struggled with the same thing. He was a man of strong beliefs, proud of the life he had built. But as his children grew older, they didn't always agree with him. Conversations turned into debates, debates turned into arguments, and soon, they just stopped talking about important things altogether. Martin felt frustrated. "They don't listen to me anymore," he told me once. But I asked him, Do you listen to them? That question changed everything for him. Instead of lecturing, he started asking. Instead of assuming he knew best, he tried to understand. He didn't always agree, but he made space for their perspectives. And something shifted. His children started opening up again. They started calling more, not because they had to, but because they wanted to share their lives with him. I learned that lesson too. Instead of clinging to old ways, I chose to bend, to listen, to learn. I still held onto my values, but I no longer forced them onto my children. And when they saw that I respected them as individuals, they returned that respect to me as their father. If you feel like your children no longer hear you, ask yourself, have I been listening to them? The world changes, and so do relationships. When you show your children that you are willing to grow, to learn, to meet them halfway, you will find that respect isn't something you have to ask for. It's something that naturally returns to you. 7. Respect comes when you stop seeking approval. I remember the first time I felt it, the subtle but undeniable shift in how my children treated me. It wasn't a dramatic event, no raised voices or outright disrespect, just small things that added up over time. My opinions were brushed aside, my words met with impatient sighs, and my presence in their lives seemed less of a priority. I had spent my whole life providing for them, thinking that love and sacrifice would always be met with gratitude. But when I reached my later years, I found myself sitting in a quiet house, wondering where that respect had gone. It wasn't just me. My old friend Thomas once confided in me about his own struggles. He had worked tirelessly to give his children a better life, never saying no when they needed something, always putting them first. As they grew older, he thought his kindness and sacrifices would bring them closer. Instead, they started treating him like an afterthought. When he called, they were too busy. When he gave advice, they rolled their eyes. He laughed it off at first, but I could see the sadness in his eyes when he said, "I don't know when I stopped being their father and became just another obligation." At first, I tried harder to win back their attention. I made myself available, offered help whenever I could, and tried to keep the peace by avoiding conflicts. But the more I did, the more invisible I felt. I realized something painful. When you seek approval from your children, you give away your power. They don't respect a person who is always bending over backward to please them. They respect someone who values themselves. I thought about Richard, a man from my neighborhood. He had once been fierce and independent, but as he aged, he let his children make all the decisions. He stopped voicing his opinions and adjusted his life to fit theirs. He told himself he was keeping the family together, but in the process, he lost himself. The result? His children no longer saw him as a strong presence but as someone who would always yield. He became someone they took for granted, not out of malice, but because he had unknowingly taught them that his needs were secondary. That was when I decided to make a change. I stopped trying to be the ever-available father, always waiting for their calls. I started saying no when I needed to. When they asked for favors, I helped when it was reasonable, but I no longer dropped everything to accommodate them. I spoke my mind, not to argue, but because I had thoughts worth expressing. I made decisions for myself, not just for them. It was uncomfortable at first. I could tell they noticed the difference. But then something surprising happened. They started listening. They started valuing my time because I showed them that my time was valuable. I won't lie and say it was easy. There were moments when I felt guilty, moments when I wondered if I was being too harsh. But then I remembered Thomas, Richard, and countless other parents who had spent their later years feeling dismissed and unimportant. I realized that respect isn't something you demand, it's something you inspire. And the best way to inspire it is to live in a way that commands it, by respecting yourself first. So, to any parent feeling the sting of being overlooked, I say this: Stop seeking their approval. Stop waiting for their validation. Live your life with dignity, set boundaries with love, and show them through your actions that your worth is not dependent on their recognition. And in time, they will see you not as someone waiting for their attention, but as someone they deeply respect. Life has a way of teaching us lessons in the quietest of moments. Respect is not something we can demand. It is something we inspire through the way we carry ourselves, through the boundaries we set, and through the lives we choose to live. If your children have started treating you differently, if their respect seems to have faded, know that it's not the end of the road. The answer isn't in arguments or in reminding them of your sacrifices. It's in the quiet confidence of knowing your worth. It's in building a life that is full and meaningful outside of them. It's in respecting yourself first, because when you do, others will follow. So ask yourself, am I waiting for their approval, or am I living in a way that commands respect? If you've felt overlooked or taken for granted, it's not too late to change things. Start today. Set those boundaries, focus on your happiness, and show them, not with words, but with actions, that your presence is valuable. And in time, they will see you not as someone waiting for their attention, but as someone they deeply respect. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever struggled with feeling unappreciated by your children? How have you handled it? Share your story in the comments. I read every message, and your experiences could help someone else going through the same thing. And if this video spoke to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss future content. Your support helps bring these important conversations to more people who need them. Thank you for spending this time with me. I appreciate you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care, and until next time, stay strong, stay wise, and keep living with purpose.